Tony Webster begins as an older, retired man who thinks of himself as essentially ordinary, decent, mildly detached, and not especially dramatic. Looking back on his school days, he remembers a close-knit group of boys who treated ideas as a way of confronting life before life had really begun. Even in these early recollections, the novel suggests that memory is not a record but a performance. Among Tony's school friends, Adrian Finn stands apart. He is brilliant, philosophical, and unusually serious, the kind of young man who seems to live at a greater intellectual depth than everyone else around him. The boys admire him partly because he can explain things, but also because he makes their ordinary fears and confusions feel connected to bigger questions. One day the school is shaken by the suicide of another student after a girl becomes pregnant. The boys, and especially Adrian, begin talking about responsibility, causation, and the meaning of an act after death. Barnes uses this episode to establish that for these characters, ideas are never just abstract, they are rehearsals for future moral failures. Tony then moves into university life, and the tone shifts from adolescent theory to the awkwardness of actual adulthood. He drifts, as many young people do, through friendships, uncertainty, and the hope that life will eventually resolve into a stable shape. What he remembers most clearly from this period is not success, but emotional confusion. It is during this time that Tony begins a relationship with Veronica Ford. She is intelligent, elusive, and difficult for him to read, and he becomes both drawn to and unsettled by her. Rather than understanding her complexity, he turns her into a puzzle whose resistance makes him feel inadequate. Veronica's family deepens Tony's discomfort. When he visits them, he feels subtly judged, classed, and misread, and he senses that they understand him better than he understands them. Her mother, Sarah Ford, in particular, seems to notice more than she says, which leaves Tony with the unnerving feeling that he has entered a situation whose terms are not visible to him. Tony and Veronica's relationship is marked by frustration, miscommunication, and asymmetry. He wants emotional clarity and sexual completion, she remains guarded, ironic, and withholding in ways he experiences as both insulting and fascinating. Instead of asking what she might be protecting or perceiving, he centers his own confusion and resentment. Eventually, the relationship collapses. Tony tells himself it was simply one of those youthful entanglements that go nowhere, painful at the time but trivial in retrospect. Yet the emotional sting remains, and the fact that he continues to remember it so vividly suggests that it wounded his pride more deeply than he admits. Then comes the event that seems, in Tony's memory, to confirm the unfairness of life. Veronica begins seeing Adrian. Adrian, Tony's admired friend, writes to him with a kind of honesty that appears courteous on the surface, asking whether Tony would mind. Tony replies outwardly, but beneath that outwardness something darker is forming. In his younger self, jealousy becomes cruelty. Hurt by the pairing of Veronica and Adrian, Tony sends a letter that is far uglier than the reasonable man he later imagines himself to be. The letter is spiteful, accusatory, and vindictive, and it matters because it shows that beneath Tony's self-image there always existed a capacity for malice. Not long after, Adrian kills himself. Tony, like everyone else, receives this fact as a tragedy, but also as a kind of philosophical confirmation of Adrian's seriousness. Because Adrian had always seemed deeper than other people, his death becomes absorbed into a narrative of tragic intelligence rather than examined as the result of painful, human entanglements. Tony goes on to live what he sees as a normal life. He marries, has a daughter, divorces without catastrophe, and settles into the mild routines of later middle age. He prides himself on having done little harm and having asked little of life, which is precisely the self-protective myth the novel is about to dismantle. Then, years later, Tony receives a letter informing him that Sarah Ford, Veronica's mother, has died and left him a small amount of money, along with the promise of something else far stranger, Adrian's diary. This inheritance breaks open the sealed chamber of the past. Suddenly, what Tony thought was over becomes active again. Tony expects the diary to explain Adrian's death and perhaps confirm the version of events he has long carried with him. But Veronica has the diary, or access to it, and refuses to simply hand over clarity. Instead, she becomes once more an obstructing presence in his life, except now the obstruction feels less like cruelty and more like a warning. Tony begins pursuing Veronica through emails, meetings, and increasingly anxious attempts to reconstruct what happened decades earlier. He thinks he is solving a mystery, but Barnes makes clear that he is also defending a cherished idea of himself. Every gap in the past becomes dangerous because what might fill it is not just information, but blame. As Tony re-enters this old story, he starts to recognize that his memory has edited events in his favor. Things he had flattened into simple emotional truths now appear unstable, and moments he once dismissed begin to take on new significance. The novel's great tension comes from watching a man realize that forgetting may not be innocence at all. Veronica remains difficult to interpret, but her difficulty now feels earned rather than arbitrary. She seems to know that Tony is still misunderstanding the situation, still narrating everything around his own injury. Her anger suggests not merely bitterness, but exhaustion with a man who has never grasped the consequences of his own behavior. Eventually, Tony learns of the existence of a man named Adrian Finn Jr., a disabled adult connected in some crucial way to the history he is trying to uncover. At first Tony misreads the revelation, assuming the obvious explanation, that this must be the child of Veronica and Adrian. That mistake reveals how stubbornly he still arranges facts into the most convenient pattern. The truth is far more unsettling. Adrian Finn Jr. is not the son of Veronica and Adrian, but the child of Adrian and Sarah Ford. In other words, Veronica's brilliant former boyfriend had an affair with her mother, and the result was a child whose vulnerable existence embodies the full human consequence of choices Tony once treated as intellectual drama. This revelation rearranges the emotional architecture of the novel. Adrian is no longer simply the noble thinker who exited life on philosophical grounds. He becomes a man entangled in morally compromised intimacy. Veronica is no longer merely withholding, she is a person who has lived for decades with humiliation, damage, and a burden of care that Tony never imagined. Tony must also confront the role of his own vicious letter. In it, he had spitefully urged Adrian to ask Veronica's mother about matters of character and desire, not realizing how close his insult may have come to naming a possibility already latent in the situation. Whether the letter caused anything directly remains unresolved, but its poison undeniably entered the chain of events. The novel refuses Tony the relief of total certainty. He cannot calculate exact proportions of guilt, nor can he know how much his letter influenced Adrian's later actions. But what he can no longer maintain is the comforting fiction that he was merely a peripheral observer in other people's tragedy. In old age, Tony comes to see that life's gravest errors are not always crimes of melodramatic scale. Sometimes they are failures of attention, failures of imagination, failures to understand what other people are suffering while we remain absorbed in our own wounded vanity. The book's moral force lies in that recognition: the ordinary person can do great harm without ever thinking of himself as harmful. Barnes closes not with resolution, but with a sharpened awareness of time and consequence. Tony does not become noble, and the past is not redeemed by being better understood. Instead, he is left with the knowledge that history is not what happened, but what survives in damaged minds, partial records, and belated acts of recognition. In the end, the sense of an ending is about the terror of discovering that your life has not meant what you thought it meant. It shows how memory protects the self by arranging events into a tolerable shape, and how truth, when it finally arrives, often comes too late to repair anything. That is why the novel lingers. It is not simply about a mystery from the past, but about the unbearable possibility that we have been the wrong narrator of our own story all along. If you learned something new, let us know in the comments what books you would like to see us do next. Happy learning, we hope to see you in the next video.